we've been able to really identify what's working, what's not working, but then also the culture in Idaho. So our funding was embedded and fully funded for an entire year. So we now have had from July 1st of 2019 to the end of June of 2020, a full year cycle of funding. So we've been able to analyze data for the first time really as a state on just demographics, on age groups, location, themes, just kind of the functioning of human trafficking and what it looks like. So what we've also recognized now that we've just ended our first grant cycle year is analyzing the best practices, but just what's working best for the culture in Idaho. And when we first launched, we launched as a clinic under Optum Idaho and some other private insurances. We realized pretty quickly that that became a conflict with our funding through the victims of crime. And there were a lot of risk factors. So it increased risk in privacy standards, violating a lot of exposure to just identification. And so once we started to analyze the barriers that working at, under a provider through a for-profit embedded in our nonprofit organization, that we needed to remove those barriers. So now fully funded as a nonprofit agency, we were able to remove the providership and just provide services, ensure those services and supports through community partnerships, direct referrals, and then just ensuring that internally we're providing immediate services and support. And we've seen it's been most successful. So within just the past 2 months, we've been able to respond to the emergency needs through our crisis hotline. So once we removed those barriers, we've now identified and working with about 50 community partners. As Lisa said, who's on the line, she is one of our direct referral community partners for trauma services. And so what we've seen is we've been able to reduce the barriers in that conflict with our grants, because we've been able to just forward them to the provider for direct services in that way. Our hotline is now moving forward to becoming a statewide resource line. It will be volunteer-led and volunteer-based, and we are just now starting the training, providing training for volunteers so we can launch that. But our crisis line since COVID hit has nearly quadrupled in calls. Within just this past year, in analyzing our numbers, we served about 308 individuals, and that was through all direct services. So direct services for all forms of counseling and peer support and case management, but housing, rental assistance, food assistance, transportation, and really just meeting those individual needs. And so 308 would be within the Treasure Valley and expanded a little bit into Canyon County. So if you can imagine those numbers, they're very, very high in that just being in the Treasure Valley and a little bit in Canyon County, that's not even a statewide effort yet. So, so we know that we're really looking at something that's a lot bigger than we anticipated. Because of that, we've just now brought on a new case manager, and we'll be partnering with Pathways Boise Crisis Center for to place another case IATC case manager there, so that we can actually start providing some case management intensive support and crisis supports within the Boise Crisis Center. Transportation seems to be one of the #1 needs when we receive calls through our hotline, whether that's assistance in relocation, assistance in escorting someone locally to us so that we could provide those services and support, or being able to make a direct referral even outside of the state for risk factors, and then assist in that. So transportation and having those partnerships with local transportation companies is pretty critical as well, so that we can ensure the privacy and the safety of each person that we're working with. victim advocacy is part of our grant. It is a requirement. So we provide advocacy in the forms of forensics interviews, law enforcement interviews, maybe through the court process, and when necessary, if there's legal representation, then we make that direct referral as well. So again, utilizing our community partners is the most critical in that continuum of care, and we're ensuring safety and support through an agreement, and especially privacy standards. Our volunteer program is one of the, it is really the basis of our success. We have such a large volunteer presence, individuals who really just want to jump on board and contribute in some way. So our volunteer coordinator has been instrumental in responding to the front lines needs since COVID. We've really assisted shelters, we've assisted food banks, we've assisted residential care facilities in some form of support, whether that's just on-site, any kind of volunteer support, collecting items for maybe those different entities, and then within our care facilities providing art programming, skill building. Our volunteers have done some cooking classes. They've been able to pop in and provide craft nights, and so it's just been a really great opportunity for us to get more involved, but then it's just wherever we can. So I would say with COVID, from our perspective, there's been a silver lining, and that we've been able to really expand in our reach. The direct partner referrals, again, really critical in the success of our work. So our crisis response, we do an initial risk intake, and then by assessing those needs, it'll either go to a direct referral, assessing suicide risks, or it's a 911 emergency call. And then there's a safety plan and a case plan that's implemented if it is internal. It goes directly to our case manager, and if it's internal, and then that case plan is ongoing. There is no cap on how much services that we provide through that supportive service. If it's referred outside of our agency, we will continue to be a support or just that soft handoff. And so providing all of the direct referrals and supportive efforts through the case plan, we've seen a lot of success with that. So we'll get into what's human trafficking, then we'll get into some of the trauma approaches. And then, like I said, we'll talk about some prevention. We'll talk about some ideas of how we can really start combating this as a community in the state. Human trafficking is, originally there's a federal law that identifies human trafficking through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Idaho lacked the definition and didn't have human trafficking identified in our law. So a year ago, we were instrumental in assisting in the push for human trafficking to be defined in Idaho law so that we could really advocate for law enforcement to start investigations and arrests around human trafficking. Through our efforts, what we were able to analyze is that we still have stigma around human trafficking in Idaho. We are so far behind in our efforts. Some states really have been working on this cause for anywhere from 10 to 20 years. So where we are just now really launching this, again, within just the past 3 years. So the stigma is still an issue, the buy-in is still an issue. And then really one of the setbacks is getting this content and information into our school districts. That's something that we've hit a lot of barriers there, though we have some high schools just randomly placed throughout the state that have been receptive of it. We're not able to really get some concrete content age appropriately in schools in front of students. I know that there's a lot of online safety curriculum. There's a lot of talk about safety measures, but truly understanding what human trafficking is, as well as having a key indicator. We don't have a screener in Idaho that actually screens specifically for sex trafficking. So victims typically fall into some other category. So whether it's child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence. So we see that as a barrier to accurately identify victims. And it's also a barrier to proof that is actually happening in Idaho. So through force, fraud, or coercion, now we have it identified in Idaho law, but I want to note that there's never been one conviction in Idaho for human trafficking. So that's still a big uphill battle. Most law enforcement agencies, dispatch, and even our court systems don't realize that we do have a new law, human trafficking, identified, and it is specified under sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So it has there's a full definition there. It can be linked to that so that we can actually start looking at if someone is a victim of human trafficking rather than convicting them of prostitution. And some of the misconceptions as well is that a minor actually can be arrested or charged with prostitution. So in inducing a minor into commercial sex act is automatically human trafficking. So federally, it's identified the age of consent being 18 years old, then that default is any minor is considered a victim of human trafficking if there is proof of force, fraud, or coercion. So the three elements that actually go along with that, they're defined through the act, the means, and the purpose. The act would be what is done, so the recruitment or transportation, transfer. Most people, I would say, so I have actually offered over 300 human trafficking 101 trainings in the past few years. And through that process, typically what I hear is that most people consider it to be human smuggling, and that's kind of the default. And it's not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is individuals who are right here in this state, whether it's within the family structure, whether it's within a spouse. It is individuals who are either native or who have come into the state from surrounding states. So typically, we will see individuals who are crossing borders in Spokane, in Ontario, in Utah. All of those borders have been identified as significant human trafficking transactions that are happening. So what is done, and this is typically how law enforcement would actually look at an investigation to see the elements of human trafficking. So any recruitment, any of that transportation, and then the means, how is it done? It is done so through force, fraud, abductions, which is pretty rare in Idaho, but it does happen within our Native American population and our refugee population. Unfortunately, those are the two categories or populations of individuals who come at a higher price. And so that demand actually causes traffickers to resort to abduction because they know that there is a high price included in that. And then it's through deception, use of power. We've actually seen use of power a lot throughout the state. Some individuals within leadership positions, those who may be well known in their communities and wouldn't be questioned. We see that through the means. False promises, so giving payments or benefits, controlling somebody through blackmail, maybe false, there may be false contracts, false job offers. And so those modeling careers or acting careers or just even sexual exploitation, where during COVID, the biggest concern would be those who are desperate enough to make money and respond to solicitation of sexual exploitation. And that may be because of extreme poverty, or obviously they need to buy food or, really contribute to those basic necessities. Those vulnerabilities are what can put an individual or a family at risk for falling into a human trafficking, coercive and deceptive approach. And then the purpose would be done so through exploitation. That is the purpose. Sexual exploitation, slavery, servitude. We do see an overlap with labor trafficking and sex trafficking. That would be an example of that would maybe be an illicit massage parlor, and that would be so an individual who's actually performing a duty, an act, a job of some sort, and typically in the form of some servitude or slavery, and then the sexual act itself. So the FBI has identified about 260 illicit massage parlors in Idaho. What we've done as a coalition is really analyze what are the barriers to individuals within the community or even law enforcement to actually get in and do some investigations. And that has to do with a lot of our city ordinances. And the city ordinances in most of our counties don't require businesses to register with the Secretary of State. By not registering a business, we see a lot of pop-up storefronts. They're not functioning as what they claim. Behind closed doors, they're actually selling individuals, so through exploitation or sex acts. So we've seen that to be a big issue. One of our efforts will be really to look at those city ordinances and advocate for businesses to register and provide some form of oversight, especially in that there isn't oversight enough to be able to even go in to a business and analyze. And so where human trafficking and vulnerabilities overlap, traffickers will target those who are in the most vulnerable state and where they're savvy enough. They'll target homeless shelters, substance use treatment facilities, any kind of community center, drop-in center. They certainly know how to target and prey on individuals who they can offer to meet those basic necessities. They know that within the Department of Corrections or prisons or reentry centers, they'll put money on their accounts, they'll write them letters, they'll start with that grooming process of fake relationship building, start giving them promises of hope. And I can provide you with shelter, I can provide you with a home, I will feed you, showering them with gifts. So that grooming process is a way to lure somebody in, especially someone who is vulnerable. So if we really want to talk about preventative measures, it will ensure that individuals who are even facing homelessness actually have a place to live, so that we can prevent them from falling prey to those who are going to target them. And so if we're looking at the individuals who are at risk, I do want to note, though, there isn't anyone exempt. So it doesn't just fall into these at-risk categories. It actually is anybody who will respond. So Solicitation Online is one of the top places where traffickers will prey on individuals. And that's through any type of communication. So it can be through all various apps. It's not just children and youth who fall prey. Anyone can. Any type of dating app, any type of gaming app, communication apps, chat rooms, and it can be any place that has ads posted, so buy and sell places. And those places online, that's where you'll see even blatant solicitation. So homeless and runaways, I would say, we're a huge advocate to remove this idea that an individual is a runaway, therefore considered a throwaway. Nobody's looking for them. And so analyzing the reason, why did somebody run away? And, was there a history or family abuse? Is the home an unsafe location? But if we continue to look at and view runaways through a punitive process, it's a misdemeanor. And we're also putting that punitive process on individuals who want to support and help runaways. If that's a misdemeanor as well. So you're creating a barrier to potentially identifying a massive amount of individuals, children or minors, who are missing. Nobody's looking for them. So that is a large group of individuals that traffickers will hone in on, because they know that they're not in the database. Nobody's looking for them. So they're not going to be. There's no risk factor there for traffickers. The risk factor is unfortunately for our kids who have been put in a category that they're runaways. children in foster care, we know, are a huge target because of those vulnerabilities, offering them a better life, offering them the family lifestyle will protect you. It's ensuring that they'll have a better life. And then we do see that families that come from parents that are incarcerated or just youth detention centers, we've seen and come across a lot of recruiters who are children and youth. We've identified recruiters who've been paid by traffickers to recruit their friends as young as elementary school. So that is, we're increasingly seeing some alarming statistics right now just from our own experiences, and should definitely get this information into our school system. LGBTQ, anybody who's actually been ostracized from their community or even within their home, and so those marginalized and underserved or discriminated against are certainly prime targets as well. Gang affiliation in Idaho is pretty significant as well, something that's not on a lot of people's radar. And so gangs are, they rally, they really will wrap around individuals and create a family lifestyle. And so those who fit into the homeless or foster care or history of Department of Corrections, and where they are really, they'll gravitate to a group of individuals that feel like this is a family. And so we see that with gang affiliation. Our Native Americans and our refugees are, again, very high demand. So they're populations that really need this information as well. Online solicitation, false education, false job opportunities, and then familial trafficking, which is within the family structure. I want to note on a national level, it's been identified that about 97% of children who have been trafficked knew their perpetrator. So it is a statistic worth sharing because most people do think it's in the form of abduction or that it's done so through a stranger. And it's been reported that they know their perpetrator. So that may be within a place of employment, could be within the community, maybe within a church or at school. It can be within a family structure, an extended family member, or even a close family friend. So something to just keep in mind. It's really changed my perspective, especially in raising my youngest child. It's night and day, and now the way that I just approach relationships and having to evaluate the way that I allow my daughter to interact with people doesn't mean you go around and just start pointing fingers and make assumptions, but knowing these statistics, it's something to pay close attention to. The additional risk factors, and these are the things that we've been able to identify through our data. The lack of personal safety, so individuals who don't have a safe place, emotional distress, so where there may be added layers of stress or distress, history of abuse and neglect, extreme poverty, we know for sure, and or family dysfunction. There may be a generation, just generationally or incestually, that human trafficking is happening within the family structure. That is a really hard one to identify because of the double life that children are trained to live. It might look like some other form of abuse. So maybe it might look like child abuse, or it might look like neglect or sexual abuse or domestic violence, where we are really encouraging people to go a step further, a couple of steps further, pull in agencies like ours to help with any kind of assessment process or just even relationship building, because the relationship itself is a pathway to self-identification. And then child sexual abuse and assault, mental illness, where there's a history of trauma, disabilities, prime target, those who not able to advocate for themselves are used in all forms of exploitation and sexual exploitation, where that's where selling nude pictures online, selling illicit pictures online, child sex exploitation is a high demand as well. And we are seeing kids, very young, that are blatantly solicited online. So looking at these additional risk factors, it gives us an opportunity as a state to evaluate our programming, our protocols, and then how we're actually sharing this educational information, especially to programs who are supporting these individuals who fit into these risk factors. Promoting sexual exploitation by family members and or peers, and then the lack of social support, that isolation. So recognizing that even with COVID, we promote programs and state agencies and even local agencies to get creative in how those who do house calls, those who visit families in their homes, even through telehealth opportunities, really any program that can potentially assess for additional red flags, additional characteristics, so that we can start even some supportive efforts as well for prevention. Just to note, out of 251 individuals that we've supported, this is within the past few months. Giving some demographics, some history of those. 21% were minors, and we have hit now every single age bracket. So our brackets start from 0 to 11. We've hit that age group, and then 16 over. We've also hit that age group. So every single age group, we've been able to identify an individual who is either currently a victim of human trafficking or previously a victim. So if you look at 37% of the adults that we've supported through direct support have been identified as a victim of sexual abuse as a minor. That also included human trafficking. So in that, we know that we're identifying or working with adults who actually were victims of children. So it is important to note that as we're addressing minors and children, youth and young adults, it's critical that we are continuing our efforts to support adults. We see a lot of spouses that are selling their spouse, and that may be an evolving process. We've identified individuals who are at risk and currently being groomed by their spouse to then sell for through sex acts and exploitation. And then 47% identified as having a mental or physical disability. 20% were identified as being an issue of stalking or harassment. And then 5% were victims of child pornography. 23% experienced homelessness. That number has increased to, I believe, about 38% of our the victims that we're working with right now have identified themselves as facing homelessness currently. So we're really trying to support those by assisting and ensuring housing opportunities, transitional housing, and maybe safe housing, and really linking to all of our community partners to ensure that we're meeting those needs. And so possible behavior indicators, so this is where we're really getting into some of the school environment or community environment. Those that you start to pay attention to some different behaviors, some different circumstances from our students, an inability to attend school, so on a regular basis, where you're seeing maybe those that are they're not visible, and frequently running away, frequent traveling from cities in and out of the states that they're talking about. They're leaving, they're going on vacation, or they're traveling a lot, and this may be a different circumstance for these families. Bruises, there's always signs of some physical trauma, and then lack of control over their personal schedule. So where you might see that they're having to go somewhere, they have to do something that they're not in charge of scheduling, that they'll you can pick up on some of those key terms where, yeah, I have to go somewhere tonight, or I'm being forced to go do, something tonight. So where it may be secretive, you can kind of hone in on so some of those key indicators. Malnourished and maybe inappropriately dressed. So typically they're not dressed for the environment or the occasion. A lot of times malnourished because they're exhausted. Most likely there's substance abuse because traffickers will induce some form of substance as a way to control victims. So paying close attention to exhaustion, maybe looking tired and frazzled, and then signs of some form of drug addiction, maybe through being coached or coerced as well. So they'll train victims how to speak, how to respond to certain questions. Traffickers are savvy enough to know exactly what community professionals are going to ask our children and youth. And then some uncharacteristics within an individual where you may notice that there's a little bit more sexual activity or maybe inappropriate age-specific activities. So those students who really do respond to solicitation through certain apps on their phone. We have talked to so many youth through assemblies that we were doing before COVID, and they, so many of them were open and really honest with us and said, yeah, they get private messages all the time of just people asking for new pictures. So really, really talking to our youth. I would encourage school districts or even college campuses to create support groups or some kind of human trafficking group within our youth voice, so that they can share with us what it's like to navigate these apps, what it's like to when individuals are soliciting them, that relationship building through online communication. It doesn't look like a trafficker. It doesn't sound like a trafficker. So it's confusing for our youth and young adults to even know how to navigate it. Even though this conversation's been happening for quite some time now, it still is hard to pinpoint. But paying close attention to these. And I do want to say that I can follow up with these slides. I can send them to you. I can send you additional material as well, because I know that we're looking at a timeline, and I want Lisa to be able to talk about some of her trauma approaches. And then forms of grooming, we did touch on this, and I will follow up with some of this information as well. Where does it happen? It happens in every single one of these places in Idaho. So we know for a fact our hotels and motels, there are transactions of human trafficking. We've witnessed it, we've experienced it. We now are able to get a lot of input from the victims and the survivors that we are working with. Our illicit massage parlors, like I said, identified about 260 in Idaho. That's a problem, but we know that trafficking is happening there. Rented properties, Airbnbs, rented houses, all of our truck stops. We lack appropriate laws to support even education awareness. Idaho doesn't allow for any type of posters or postage in our bathrooms, our community bathrooms, our truck stops, or even convenience stores. And so another advocacy effort that we're really pushing forward to, you'll see in all of those border towns like Spokane or Ontario and Utah, you'll see in all of those bathrooms and those truck stops, or even in a lot of their convenience stores, you'll see in the bathroom stalls that they do have, National Human Trafficking Hotline. And in this case, it can also link to ours, but Idaho doesn't allow them to. We don't have a law that supports that. So big push. And then any of the construction sites, a lot of places that don't have oversight, so they still have man camps, they still have the oil and gas industries, where they actually unfortunately shuttle kids and youth for human trafficking purposes. We see that a lot with our Native Americans and within our rural areas where there may be farming, housing, and migrant work. And then why victims stay. So this is our one of our top questions is why don't they just leave? Why can't they just tell somebody? And fear is a significant reason. There may be fear of with death threats. The death threats are legitimate. Those are not just false threats to their family, maybe threats, of course, to themselves. And victims typically have witnessed or experienced such an extreme level of abuse from their trafficker that those threats are taken seriously. There may be fear of homelessness, or it may be in a survival mode. I think it's important to note as we get into trauma, the trauma bond is very significant. Stockholm Syndrome is common. So falling in love with the trafficker, that's where we're really struggling to get self-identification. We have to remove this idea that a victim is going to tell you that they're a victim. They just will not. Mostly because they don't view themselves as a victim, but also because they are, that trauma bond protects the trafficker. They'll protect them. It may be a parent, it may be a spouse, it may be a family member. They may feel obligated. The trauma bond might give them a sense of obligation or guilt. So there's various reasons and perspective to really evaluate in the way that we approach potential victims so that we remove any judgment that'll prevent us from truly supporting and understanding where victims are. Substance use, and then they don't view themselves as a victim. It's also important to note the level of abuse, where most of us can't even fathom what it's like to be a victim of human trafficking, but not just a victim of abuse and control and coercion of a trafficker, and that is ongoing and it's very significant, but by the buyer as well. So where we lack a lot of education and awareness is around the fact that there is a seller and there is a buyer. And when you have those two components, those are ongoing levels of abuse. And so imagine that a victim is actually expected to provide his or her services 5 to 10 times a day or night. And so with that, that's an abuse from a buyer over and over and over. The victim's also enduring a level of emotional, mental, and physical abuse from the trafficker. We do know that a lot of buyers are abusive as well. So the level of trauma is so significant, it supersedes any other abuse or a victim of crime act because of how much an individual endures on a daily basis. Really important to note. And then who are the traffickers? They're anybody. We have experienced all demographics, all backgrounds, any level of professionalism, from high end to low end. It really just doesn't discriminate. And then the types of traffickers, and again, because I want to get into the trauma, this is information I will follow up with. I will make sure that you have content that you can go back to, you can review these slides. But a trafficker can be a pimp, can be a family member, can be within a gang, can be an employer and a recruiter. And then how do they control them? We're leading now into the trauma part of it. Control tactics are in all forms of emotional abuse and physical abuse, isolation. I mean, every single approach that a trafficker can take to control somebody. Substance use is a pretty common one, especially getting an individual who may be resistant, maybe a little rebellious. They'll induce drugs onto that person to ensure that they are calm, they're submissive, and they're not able to advocate for themselves. And so really looking at that power and control wheel, most of you have probably seen this, but really important to note that as it pertains to sex trafficking and labor trafficking, looking at all of these forms of power and control, they're implemented. And so if you're looking at coercion and threats, intimidation, sexual abuse, then you have the emotional cycle. You have the blaming and minimizing, and then you have showering them with gifts and I love you. and then abuse, emotional abuse, and then physical abuse. So there's a vicious cycle of trauma that's happening where victims start to lose themselves. They start to lose an understanding of or recognition of abuse. They start to feel like this is normal. They're going to expect to get some kind of physical or emotional or mental abuse come at them, and then they may be rewarded for doing something. So there's a constant vicious cycle of trauma that is happening there. And so control through substance use, we see this often. Substance use being an increasingly common method of recruitment, using it as a way to control, especially if an individual is going through withdrawals, they'll use drugs. You need to do this act, and then I'll give you drugs. Traffickers will use it as a form of reward or punishment. So it's a really, it is one of their top techniques of keeping an individual under their control. And then unfortunately, those who are survivors are more vulnerable to falling prey, falling back into sex trafficking because of the use of substance. And then now getting into Lisa's part. Lisa, I'm going to let you take over here. We'll get into a few slides of trauma and then some of the approaches that Lisa takes. But just to note, fight, flight, and freeze is what we all have been trained on as far as trauma approaches. Really understanding what happens to an individual within these stages. But with human trafficking, it goes further, and not just one step, but it goes beyond freeze to please. And individuals, victims will learn quickly, I better do this, I better please. So once there's a freeze, then there's somewhat of a disassociation. Then they get to a place where they're like, I'm just going to please my trafficker. It may be even in the form of, again, falling in love with them, or a trauma bond where it's inappropriate, it's unhealthy, but they'll bond anyway. And that's pleasing. It may be even a parent or a loved one where pleasing them is like, yeah, this is my duty. This is what I have to do. Appease is now just complete disassociation. You are told the individual is completely disassociated from the situation. I'm now just getting through it. I'm just appeasing the situation by now just going through the motions. So just wanted to note that. And then now, Lisa, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jen. So in 2017, this was a $150 billion industry. I'm sure it's increased drastically since then. And it's kind of like this dirty little secret that nobody likes to talk about. And every time, like, Jen and I do a training, it feels so heavy and dark and edgy. And it's troublesome, and it should make us upset. It should enrage us. It should make us frustrated. This is, it's a very dark subject. And I think awareness is absolutely the first step. And as a therapist, nothing's going to happen in my office that's going to be helpful for them until they feel absolutely safe. And so I tend to spend a lot of time with them in the beginning, just trying to establish safety way beyond what I would do for, say, a single incident trauma like an acute trauma. So we spend quite a bit of time together working together so that they feel like they don't have to flee, where they're safe and they have sanctuary, and that they're not judged, and that they have safety. And maybe sometimes we have to also make sure they're getting the resources that they need outside of that clinical time together. So if I'm seeing them only for a very small time during the week, I want to make sure they're equipped with tools and techniques to self-soothe, to calm down the body. So it's so different than, say, acute or even chronic trauma. So kind of wanted to get into that right now, because I've found that there are some techniques that seem to be rather helpful, and they respond to them a little quicker than, say, standard psychotherapy or talk therapy, if you will. So Jennifer mentioned some signs to look for, and that's super important, right? Because awareness absolutely has to happen at this level. So we need to be aware and know what to look for. There's a couple other things that I kind of notice, especially with kids. They tend to be pretty tired. So if you're noticing kids that are excessively tired, they can't quite keep their eyes open, they keep yawning, or maybe bragging about money, or there's lots of unexplained absences or unexcused absences from class, things like that. That can be a sign too. And you know, the brain really does like what's familiar, and so sometimes people are baffled why kids don't leave, and it's just easier to stay sometimes. They don't like the abuse, but sometimes the brain doesn't like the risk of not knowing what's on the other side, or if they'll ever be able to feel safe again. And so thanks for advancing that slide, Jen. And so while these slides are coming up, I'll touch on them, but I also want to kind of talk about the clinical intervention and what seems to be helpful. And
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so really in the clinic, I'm addressing that second level there. Can you go back, Jen? That emotional level, where it's just that anxiety, anger, rage, a huge fear of lack of safety. In fact, when I'm working with them, I always have to be ready to know that they might not come back, that they might flee. And I only have so much control over that. I can't control what happens outside of that therapeutic environment, but I always have to know that I have to treat that. And I know that as clinicians, we're trained to do that anyway, but this is a very special population where they are often on the run anyway, and nothing feels safe. And so that emotional aspect and all the things that were listed there, super important. And so let's talk about the 3 different kinds of trauma, and then I'm gonna talk about EMDR. So there's acute trauma, that's like that single exposure, maybe it's a car accident. Chronic trauma would be kind of long-term. When I think of that, I think of, say, like child abuse over several years. And then there's complex trauma. And one of the differences between this trauma and the previous 2 traumas is complex trauma. The person is going to feel very trapped. They do not feel like they can get away. A good example of that might be that some of the civil unrest that some people experienced during all the looting and rioting recently. But if we're talking about sex trafficking, they feel trapped. And so let's move into EMDR. So EMDR is kind of does for talk therapy with the internet for communication. So it rapidly gets to the root of the issue by using what we call kind of sensory awareness. And so when we're using EMDR in the session, we're not just helping them change their story and believe it, we're helping their body believe it, because the body remembers everything. The body keeps the score, and many of you have heard that. Dr. Bessel van der Kerk, leading expert on trauma, he's right as rain. Man, the body remembers everything. All we have to do is remember the last time we had a bad fight with someone we care about, and boom, we're right there, we feel it. And so EMDR is an extremely effective technique, and it's one of a few, but it's an extremely effective technique, and arguably one of the top techniques to calm down the body and reframe it, and to attach a different narrative that both the brain and the heart believe. And on the other side of that is a liberation. Doesn't solve all the problems, but it begins to start changing the story for them, and these survivors need to change their story to go forward. So this kind of trauma affects neural pathways, it damages neurons, and so EMDR is a quick way to access that limbic region of the brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, to just kind of calm things down. And talk therapy just has a really hard time activating that area of the brain. So any kind of somatic or sensory intervention is very helpful for trauma and will work much faster than the standard kind of talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. And so what does that include? That would be things like EMDR, brain spotting, somatic or sensory treatment. What we want to do is make sure they can manage the affect or their emotional reaction outside of the therapeutic environment. So they need to be equipped with skills to calm themselves down. And so this trauma approach slide, absolutely, I mean, safety is going to be paramount no matter what. And that collaboration, empowerment, this is powerful. They don't, and the choice, they don't feel like they really had a choice when they first come in. This is going to take some convincing of, again, not their brain, but their body too, that they can go out into the world and begin to start feeling safer. And it takes a while. And so this is not something that's quick. So while EMDR is a rapid treatment and permanent treatment, it's certainly not something we want to jump to until they have a window of tolerance and can withstand the stress that they're going to feel with it. So it's really important not to jump to it like we might jump to it quicker with, say, a single incident like a car accident victim or survivor. So a couple of things that we tend to see with complex trauma specifically, beyond just regular trauma like PTSD, this is a little different. So this is what I would call complex PTSD, and you're not going to find it in the DSM-5, just a little bit different. So complex PTSD goes a little further. So you're going to see trauma bonding, sometimes like Jen referred to with that Stockholm Syndrome. Chronic physical pain, we see this a lot. And so EMDR is very helpful with kind of releasing that, calming it down. Addiction, extreme anxiety, depression. And when we have extreme depression, sometimes we see suicide ideation, and sometimes attempts. We see a lot of memory loss, and these survivors too, sometimes we want to watch for self-harming. And I know I'm talking to, you know, a group of clinicians here, but self-harming, we got to ask the tough questions, right? That self-harming is not going to be really salient in the session or obvious. A lot of that self-harming is going to be in places where we're not going to normally see, especially as we get into the colder months where they're covering it up, say on the upside of the inner thigh or up on the top of the inner arm, places like that. So we need to ask those tough questions and make them feel safe at the same time as they self-disclose to us. So unfortunately, and this is a part that just seems even darker to me, is that sometimes the families are involved. The family of origin has been involved. And so this isn't a patient presenting symptoms who has natural resources built into their family. And so we need to be cognizant of that as we go forward. And they're not going to find safety. For people that have familial type extortion like this, they're not going to feel safe with those close family members. And so cutting those ties is a whole other layer of trauma. It's very difficult. These were their primary caretakers. And so you can see why that safety is going to be absolutely paramount, and it has to be available and accessible to them, and they must feel that in every single session. And so what I have found that seems to be a little bit more helpful sometimes, because eye contact can be difficult for them, is I often will sit askew kind of off to the side where they don't have to look right at me. Particularly the younger ones, that eye contact is a little too intimidating for them. And of course, not for everybody. No one size fits all here, but be aware of that. That can feel very intimidating to them. So let's see. I think that as we work toward prevention, awareness, of course, the first step, and Jen's going to follow up by sending some more material to each of you as just more resources. We have to know what's available here for people, and we have to ask the tough questions. And you know, we have postcards at the coalition. We have information. Let's get information out there and not be afraid to have those tough discussions if we need to. I hope that I'm meeting the need here, and I'm kind of scratching the itch. And it's always kind of weird to talk into a screen where I'm not like in front of people that can, you know, ask questions. Yeah. So I'm going to take a look at the chat here and see if we have any questions that are coming up. I see something from Gina. Oh, the Underground Railroad social media movements help create challenges for these working. That was a question. I'm gonna let Jen field that question. It's a powerful organization though.
Yeah,
so,
what is the question? Sorry, Lisa, I
oh
can't see
yeah,
it.
no
What is
problem.
it?
So Jean, hopefully I'm saying last name right, Mucci or Mucci, says, how has the Save the Children and Operation Underground Railroad social media movements helped or created challenges for those working in trafficking prevention and intervention? Jen, do you want to field that?
Yeah, and I actually love that question. That is, it's a hard thing to address right now because on one hand, it's bringing more awareness. It's bringing some awareness to, especially a state like Idaho, where we have to expedite this effort, and we're so far behind. But it has diverted a lot of the focus areas because it's in the form of more of a rallying mentality rather than that strategic planning. And so what we've really been trying to be mindful and consistent in is we've got to look at how to combat it, how to address it, what's necessary. And so looking at these preventative measures, it is where people really are rallying right now. It's creating anger and frustration and fear. It's more so, and it can cause more division. So what we would love to see is, as a coalition and defining a coalition, meaning bringing more people alongside us who are actionable, where we really want to get information and some new protocols and processes into all of our school districts, into our community centers, are pumping more investment of increased funding and efforts into our shelters and our after-school programs. I mean, with COVID, we all have to start being mindful and creative and flexible in our approaches, and that's what we've done. We've had to readjust. We did it immediately. It was, okay, well, certainly we're not going to keep functioning the way we were due to COVID, but rather than jumping on bandwagons and going down rabbit holes, it's ensuring that we know where to get information, vetting it. You know, our funder we're federally funded, even though it's through our state agency. Our funding falls under the governor's office, but because of that, the standards are different. We don't get the luxury of just posting or putting out information that we've not been able to vet with our technical assistance program. So I hope that answers your question. I would say that it certainly has created more of a hot topic, but keeping focused is critical. So looking at these preventative measures, I would say that getting information in school districts has been very difficult. We have not been extremely successful because I would say a lot of people are afraid of this information. There is nothing worse than having to sit down and try to age appropriately talk about human trafficking. Typically after about 10 minutes, most people that are close to me just start glazing over. It's a hard topic, but it is a topic that can be done so in a form of safety, in a form of community, because victims don't typically self-identify. And and Lisa, yes, I think the information you provided was just phenomenal. It is so critical to understand the depths of trauma beyond what we've all been trained, but really paying close attention to those signs. We're not going to be able to immediately change someone's living situation, those circumstances. So what we can do as a community is just start creating a sense of safety, a sense of relationship, security, because that's when what we notice, that's when individuals will start talking, they'll start sharing. Usually they'll share about their friend, they'll share about another victim. That's typically the first start to communication. They'd rather talk about somebody else or help somebody else. And so really honing in on that, but looking at awareness for that'll trickle into any of your agencies, organizations, school districts. Those policies and the protocols are critical in that what we've seen is simple changes to them. They don't have to be formal and an investment that costs a lot of money. It's really just adding a couple of things to your standard policy. And that may be a list of emergency connections. It may be a direct link to our hotline or the national hotline, really paying attention and starting to create a group of emergency contacts that you can trust. And we have some of those. We know who we can trust and who we work closely with, where we can support and help in that identification process.
Yeah, and there's a couple
questions
questions that came in.
Okay, yeah. If you definitely want to throw those my way, Lisa.
Yeah.
I have the PowerPoint on my screen, so I can't see it.
No worries, and I'm sorry to talk over you there, but a couple of questions are coming in. Marilee Wigington's asking, she said, I work for Fremont County School District. What can I do to develop more awareness in my district? And then a couple more questions came in after that.
Yeah, and those are the questions that I can put out to the whole group. I can send out resources and information. We have them. We have online safety resources and information. We have age appropriate. We do a lot of information around age appropriate content for signs and paying attention to grooming, just how to be safe when you're utilizing online. We never want to shame any of our students, our kids, or even young adults from using the technology that we are all using. It's about being mindful and safe and setting those the safety measures on the devices, but also boundaries. So kind of readjusting the dialogue too. I would say advocating for information of how we communicate with our kids, just the safety measures. Again, just having a culture within the home that utilizes devices differently. Don't take them to bed. Make sure that parents have access to all of those devices. Monitor the chats, monitor the private messages. If you create such a sense of openness and transparency, hopefully what we do in our home, we talk about just safety measures. This isn't punitive. It isn't, I'm not here to lecture you or be angry with you. It really is about safety. It is about making sure that adults and community is supporting the potential risk factors that are coming with it. So where a kid might not notice that somebody's soliciting them, a parent may or an adult might. And so, and then of course, honing in on the possibilities of this happening within the home structure. So I can give you some information to answer your question. I can give you some content that you can share. We've had some amazing school districts, typically in rural communities, reach out to us, and that's where we were invited to come in and do assemblies. We've done huge school assembly trainings. We've actually trained on human trafficking, where it was shocking to a lot of the students, but then there were quite a few students who were asking hard questions too, and then sharing some information that we didn't expect them to share as well. So we've just seen some great outcomes of being able to really get in front of students. So where I would just lastly, because I know we're wrapping it up, as far as a service provider, just becoming an expert, really look at the resources and the information that you're investing your time into, so that you understand the level of trauma, you understand how to connect individuals to culturally competent services and community resources. Our website has a whole resource page We also have videos that'll give you, there are many videos that'll give you some perspective, what to look for in communities. And so I would encourage everyone to visit our website just to see some of the content and information that'll be valuable for you to really get to understand this, horrible topic. So safety and assessment, just to note really quickly, Health and Human Services, the human trafficking screening tool, it's a lengthy tool, so I would never suggest that you fully implement it, but it is something, it's a guide that'll give you some great insight and some ideas on maybe how to insert some screening or questions or even visibility in some of your current tools that you have. So that link is right here, but I can follow up with these slides to give you that, just some things to be mindful on safety and potential screening. And then just to end this, these are the resources that I would say have been really helpful for us. We have a hotline. Our crisis line is this phone number on the screen, and then our website. But the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children certainly, especially changing this idea that runaways shouldn't be viewed as missing. We should be advocating for that. The Polaris Project, they are a national organization, just have some great resources. We utilize them and vet a lot of our information through them. They're also linked to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and the national hotline is also linked to the Department of Justice. So there's a connection there to where it'll also link to Health and Human Services. So all of these are who we utilize as our where we vet our information, and certainly we do a lot of peer review as well. So Health and Human Services peer reviews a lot of our information and content that we put out. This safetysupportivelearning.ed is a really great resource to assist schools in implementing some new protocols or content within the schools. So these publications are a great resource. I would say definitely visit that site. And I know we are done. So just wanted to say thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Lisa, for really providing us with some great insight on trauma approaches. And yeah, we're really, really thrilled that we were invited here today.
Thank you, everybody.